Good morning, folks. Can you hear me in the back? I can see one person in the back. Can she hear me in the back? Oh, there we go. My name's Craig Gibson. I'm with forward-looking threat research within Trend Micro, and I like to walk around. So one of the things, if anybody does have a question, just sort of stick up your hand, and as long as I know your hand is in the air because my back's not turned, then I'll answer your questions. Some of my background, I was a chief security architect for an international bank, a big telco. There was also a radio broadcast company and a phone company and a bunch of other stuff, and also Trend Micro. I do a bunch of things with Europol, specifically around cyber telecom, so using sort of hacking techniques to get into telco techniques to get into hacking, and what fused threat models are unique to the combination of both. So they're neither hacking or telco, but you can actually exploit brand new things by fusing them. I was a United Nations security delegate to China in the city of Chongqing, which was 52 above that week. And luckily, I only went out for about half an hour, and luckily I made it back to the hotel. And some of the other things is that certainly when you talk about things like international revenue sharing fraud, which is a fusion of the fact that SIM cards are a kind of payment card, the fact that when you put them in phones, the phones become basically point of sale systems. And as soon as you fuse those point of sale systems with the ability to do roaming, well, now you've got a money laundering structure that is also roaming mobile. You can have a burner phone, you can do a bunch of other stuff, and you can ping all kinds of different threat models, back-end infrastructure, and so on, while still having the ability to do wire transfer within the telecom domain in a way that's completely invisible to things like money laundering and banking regulations. And I'll get into that in a little bit more, especially around satellites and orbital banking and how that overlaps with 5G. Why does anyone care about that kind of stuff when everybody's talking about IoT? Well, you can think of satellites as a kind of IoT. They're big, they're old, they're in inaccessible places, very obvious, because they're in space, and they often don't like being patched, especially if they're old. So you could think of satellites as being orbital IoT. And obviously, having chats with folks who have good stories, war stories, whatever stories, whenever possible, sometimes investigations. Some of the best stories are the ones that result in death threats. So that's usually pretty interesting. We could have a presentation that was at this level of detail. It would take forever. It would be like 12 hours. So we'll scoot ahead to some of the things that let you get the concepts so you can go back to your jobs or home or lab and actually execute. This is one of the only slides that's actually this monolithic block of text, but it's a lot faster than having 20 slides, so I put it here. So 5G, a lot of folks may think that it's just another kind of antenna. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4G. 5G is just the thing after 4. It's fundamentally different. 4G and everything before it are basically hardware-defined networks. So you have a lot of hardware that goes in your network. If you want to change it, you have to talk to individual vendors. You have to do things like patching. You have to do all this kind of stuff. 5G by its nature is software-defined mobile networking. So the infrastructure is very volatile. It changes all the time. The blocks of software in it, the virtualized network functions, are very portable. They may come from various vendors. There may be supply chain issues in that. And certainly one of the things that folks like even Donald Trump have identified is that if you don't have any control over those vendors, you don't have control over your own infrastructure, your own banking, your own national security. The other part of that as well is that in 5G, most of the models, the security models and even networking models, are fundamentally different in that one of the purposes of 5G is to be perimeterless, to have seamless interoperability with multiple kinds of radio and also multiple kinds of carrier. So you can have many carriers that share borders, but because it's intended to be perimeterless and support very interoperable billing, most of your perimeter or castle and moat based security models don't really apply. And even things like identity don't really apply. It's a very pretty slide. Obviously, I didn't make it. So this thing called 5G, all of this is 5G and a bunch of other things included. So you've got your low power wide area, your IoT, SDN, your cloud computing, which is virtualization in the back end, obviously, but when you have virtualization on the front end, that's fog computing. So between cloud and fog, cloud is relatively expensive. It's cheaper than other things, but it's relatively expensive. This is much less expensive because one of the things that telcos have as one of their primary sources of cost is electricity. If you do edge computing, guess who pays for the electricity? You guys. You don't have to read this. If you download it later, this is just for you then. I'll define all of these as we go. So I mentioned monolithic hardware networks. The thing about architecture in 4G and hardware-defined networks is that as soon as you make the architecture, the minute it's approved, it's obsolete. If something comes out the day after it's approved and funded, you're kind of screwed. Over here is a metaphor for a software-defined network. If you orchestrate it, if you build those that metadata and those network models and rules into the orchestrators, which I'll get into, it spins up a new network. If you change it, half an hour later, it spins up a new network. You're never more than half an hour obsolete, whereas this might be as obsolete as your architecture cycle, which might be 2 years, depending on whether you're a bank or a telco or a government. This is another visual metaphor. So if this bright one is your real network, this is your shadow network, which for telcos and carriers is your federally mandated network wiretap requirements. The network surveillance that all national governments, if they want to remain in power, push onto carriers. So basically, anytime you have anything happening in the real world, it also happens in the shadow world, as long as it's interesting. So this you don't have to read all of. It's just there for fluff, I guess. The most important part is over here, the gold line and the blue line. So these first 4 or 5 slides are very fluffy. They're context. Then we'll get into the good stuff. Over the years, data traffic, for competitive reasons, has been going up and up and up. If you offer 5 gigs for $20 a month, and your competitor offers 6 gigs for $20 a month, and you have to change to compete, well, that means that your revenue per meg has gone down. So because everybody's been doing that for that length since the beginning of telecom, this little crossover has come to exist. So that at this point, you stop making enough money to survive. And in places like China, where revenue was low and data was high, carriers have started going out of business already. So the point of 5G, why not have 4G? Well, 4G is kind of over here. If you have just 4G, you will hit this line and go to business. So if you have 5G and all the efficiencies and automation and machine learning and so on and so on and so on, this line gets pushed over just a little bit, and then you need 6G. So one of the ways that you can get those efficiencies in 5G that let you actually move forward and let your carrier survive so as to be able to eventually get to 6G is to have automated threat modeling in telecom. So one of the things about telecom that is a really big impact are things like telecom fraud. This doesn't get publicized very much because they have a trade association whose purpose, arguably, in my personal opinion, not my professional opinion, is to basically vacuum up all of those things that hit the telecom community across the world, create reports, and give them back to the people that already know they're being victimized. That being the case, entities like Europol have to work very intimately with carriers so as to earn enough trust to have the carriers actually tell anybody that they're under attack, because they don't want to get regulated. An individual regulation might cost an individual carrier $500 billion. So after all of that, a carrier community, $500 billion in a place like Europe. So after everything is said and done, when you actually automate this kind of risk, this is the last fluffy slide, what you wind up with is a telecom risk profile that I'll kind of summarize here. So if you have SMS spam, and you have IT security folks that are responsible for incident response, well, if they're used to doing things like, managing firewalls, managing IP addresses, what happens when you ask them to manage phone numbers? The phone numbers of your board of directors, for instance. What if they're receiving phishing and SMS phishing, whatever phishing, voicemail phishing? How does your IT security folks actually respond to that in a way at a network level that prevents your CEO from getting death threats 3 times a day, or an emerging attack in which a DDoS is done to their children at a telecom level, so now you can't call your children, and then you send them a voice phishing saying that I'm about to torture your children unless you give me all your passwords, or do something, or change policy, or go on the news and make a statement. Well, if they can't call their children, they'll probably believe you. So this is a non-standard kind of incident that most IT folks would struggle to deal with. They would call the cops. Cops would call somebody like me. I would say, well, it's kind of difficult. Telcos don't like to share the fact they're even under attack, never mind how. So you wind up getting a conference bridge with 20 carrier guys who don't want to share information. Toll fraud is another thing. So I mentioned a kind of money laundering, in which SIM cards, because they're payment cards and they're made in the same factories as credit cards, door badges and other things. There's a very small number of manufacturers of SIM cards and credit cards. And because SIM cards are a kind of payment card, all the kinds of credit card things that affect credit cards also affect SIM cards. And it's much more profound in a telecom domain, because a credit card typically has an upper limit of $7,500 or 10,000 euros or whatever it might be, whereas a SIM card is effectively an unsecured loan with no upper value. So if you use specific kinds of fraud, like one called a planned bust out, you basically desensitize the fraud platform and the back end of the telco until you can have $200,000 in balance on your SIM card times 1,000 SIM cards, and then cash it all out when the folks that you have on the inside of the telco tell you that they are under investigation. These two have a relationship, global tracking and GDPR, obviously. In 5G, the antennas are millimeter wave antennas, so they can actually tell if this is my phone, whether it's beside my ear, in my pocket, on the floor, whether I'm in the washroom of my house, whether I'm walking down the hall, how urgent I feel a call is based on how fast I'm going to, say, answer the door or do a particular thing. Very, very granular, very, very profound, and certainly ties in with the accelerometers and other things that are on phones. So if I have it in my pocket, it knows my heart rate and a variety of other things. So all of that sort of bundles into wiretap. When you have control of these sorts of things, you also have the ability to do wiretap. And that's a relatively profound thing at a government level or a bank level, because when you can listen to targeted phone numbers and phone conversations, well, now you can do insider trading. When you do blanket insider trading using the equivalent of a wiretap platform, like scraping the conversations of an entire board of directors, let's say. If you scrape the entire conversations from an entire board of directors, dump that into a text file, and then look for all the signs of mergers and acquisitions, look for large hostile takeovers or any of those kinds of high value sorts of words. Now you can do an investment plan that qualifies as insider trading. So when you compromise telecom in a fundamental way, it really undermines things like data sovereignty. So when you have a supply chain issue in things like 5G, wiretap is almost always the key goal. So this is one of my favorite threat modeling sort of maps. And I'll go through it in a little bit of detail. Down So the columns basically work out as, because telco is very much like a bank. Banking and telecom are very, very similar because all of the transactions are moving across the network. Because all the transactions are moving across the network in telecom, and they're all broken down as dollars per roaming meg or cents per minute of long distance. When you compromise any part of a telco's production network, its customer network, you're actually compromising a transaction, financial network. So if you can take advantage of the fact that one carrier charges more per meg or more per long distance minute than another, well, you can route your traffic from the cheap one, from the expensive one to the cheap one, and keep that as fraud. And you can do a whole host of other things. Devices, you can see there's a smart city, a smart factory, a smart home, industrial robots, autonomous vehicles, phones, and this little guy here who has radio interfaces going down and also up. This is a cell tower class called a femto, or a microcell, or a rogue base station, or similar things. Over here we have GSM, or 2G. We also have CDMA, which is 2G. HSPA, which is high-speed packet access. LTE, which you're probably familiar with here in Europe. 4.5G, which is the idea that you have multiple carriers. So competing carriers who are all shoveling data at X, being the phone, the device. And these three are actually doing things like key exchange in the back end, so as to do packet sequencing, so you get 3 times as much data, or even data in places that you would not have otherwise gotten it. So in terms of supply chain, this guy could be a company in Russia, this guy could be a company in China, this could be the NSA, and this is why wiretap is such a big deal when you talk about data sovereignty. In 5G, well, if you have your cell networks that are doing carrier aggregation, you may as well have your Wi-Fi, your seamless auto authentication, core peering Wi-Fi, peer with your own cell towers. And as long as they're peering with your cell towers and you're doing this, really what you're doing is having all your landline and all of your cell towers all peer with everybody that wants to. So this is why in 5G, you have a perimeterless network, because basically at a supply chain level, and you sort of know this as security professionals, at a supply chain level, everybody's a vendor of everybody else. All your vendors have access to your infrastructure. Well, if everybody in the world in 5G is a vendor of everybody else because of roaming and long distance and inter-carrier trust, everybody has access as long as they ask nice. And this guy up here is a satellite. 5G is very satellite friendly. And I'll get into that in a bit. So in 6G, what's the difference between 5G and 6G? Well, we haven't talked really about what 5G is, but 6G is basically the idea that when you wrap enough machine learning around it, your security model becomes a risk model, which is really a financial model, which really means that at a banking level, you're really talking about not about breaches, but you're talking about the cost of doing business at a completely automated level. So at that point, really what you're talking about is, if a customer is a good customer, great. If he's a bad customer, let him go. If a hacker, somebody committing fraud, is a good customer, maybe you'd keep him. If you as a telco don't have liability, because you don't have visibility into that, because your federal regulations don't allow you to have wiretap visibility into what criminals are doing, what a lot of carriers do today is they are knowingly blind so as to be able to provide knowing support for good customers who are also large organized crime entities. International revenue sharing fraud, the type of fraud that I mentioned earlier that's like money laundering. Right now, that's a $10 billion a year industry that is reported. And for the reasons I mentioned earlier, it's about 80% underreported. So it's most likely something like a $50 billion a year industry, and it goes up about 250% a year. Telecom applications, roaming long distance, local. This is 911 and emergency systems. Wireless alerting, which is something I think you have in Europe. It's basically there's a terrorist event happening, leave this area. There's a flood coming, go to this area, those kinds of alerts. And then finally, lawful intercept, which is the ability of national security agencies to break into calls and listen to them in an unencrypted kind of way. And then over here we have very traditional sort of IT data, roaming data. Over here we have a little man, a dollar sign, and a happy face. So it's basically getting people to give you money by making them happy. Terrorism and PSYOPs is basically having people stop spending or change their credit, change their economics and their economic policies at a political level by making them frightened or sad. Then we have over the top, which is Skype, typical communications, which is A party calling B party, military, law enforcement, public safety, which might include emergency number systems, typical banking, and then national security and government. Over here, as part of this threat model, we have no SIM, which is making an emergency call without any authentication of any kind, which results in things like terrorists and organized crime purposely doing break-ins into 911 call centers, knowing that telcos cannot block that. They're actually not allowed to block that. So if they can do money laundering, organized crime, and outbound calling from 911 or other life-critical systems, it actually is more profitable. And because it's no SIM, there's little or no authentication. It can be done from burner phones. SIMs, typical sort of 2G version of SIM. UMTS SIM is slightly more advanced, a slightly better key encryption. iSIM is an integrated SIM, so it's actually physically located on the board of, for instance, an industrial robot or an IoT device. An eSIM is just, it's got a lot in common with a certificate. It's basically a little virtual SIM that may sit within a chip. You may have quite a few of them within a chip. Multi-SIM is well supported by eSIM, multi-eSIM. And then finally, this guy, who's probably the biggest risk in a 5G IoT deployment, which is when you have something like a smart city, it may have 200,000 devices under one purchase order. Well, that procurement fellow has nothing to do with security, has nothing to do with incident response. If his 200,000 SIMs generate $20 million a month in billing, well, if somebody does international revenue sharing fraud by taking some SIMs out and sticking them in a cell phone for doing international revenue sharing fraud, or sticks them underneath a femtocell, or puts a femtocell in the parking lot, that procurement guy is going to have no idea that when his bill is 21 million a month, that there's anything wrong. So this bucketed subscription aggregation, when it's combined with things like no SIM authentication, well, if you have all of your subscriptions that are capable of carrying traffic, but in some circumstances no authentication is required, that's a pretty big vector. That's where a botnet would sit for doing things like money laundering and organized crime. And finally, these points, these question marks on the side, because telecom doesn't like to know the traffic that's going through this dumb pipe, because as soon as it knows, then it has to do something about it. For instance, at a counterterrorism level or other very national security kind of heavily regulated, very expensive kind of level. Because if they knew this detail, the content of all those communications, they might have to do things like surrender it to law enforcement or others. So these things, as soon as you get a hold of this end of the pipe or this end of the pipe, you basically own this entire communication. So as far as the threat model goes, this isn't actually a threat. This is just a typical communication. But because it's at this end and goes to this end, this is the same threat model path you'd use for a death threat or extortion. Here's another use of the same threat model. When you have this end of the control, so you have, for instance, an organized crime group who's using bucketed subscription aggregation, pushing it across a smart factory, pushing it across a 5G network, maybe because they've compromised part of the supply chain. part of the attack is that they have to use roaming and long distance so they can exploit inter-carrier trust by posing as one carrier to another. Then they come back into the network domain, skip it off a rogue cell tower, and then come back and start doing things like international revenue sharing fraud, for which the smart city would then owe all that money. So this is basically a threat model. Here's another version of that. As soon as you have that femtocell in there, if you route it back up to local calling, because now you have control of the entire communication, you can now skip it off things like lawful intercept, because you basically created your own lawful intercept. You have open authentication on your own femtocell network. And now you can own all of this stuff because you can see all the key exchange happening at an IPsec or other level. So how does that relate to 5G? Well, all of this is part of 5G because it's all part of the business cases that are part of 5G. So where does machine learning come into it? So I'll describe this 5G network, and then the next slide we actually get into how the threat modeling actually feeds into machine learning. So in 5G you have orchestration. So you have this automation, certification, and design studio. So this is where all your auditing happens before it ever hits the network. So this is where all your really slow stuff that makes architecture take 2 years and have to go through legal and all that sort of bureaucracy and messing around. If you actually do it all up front and then just refine very small little iterative pieces of it, what you wind up with is something that's very repeatable, and not only is its development time very fast, but you're never touching more than a tiny piece of the overall design. So as far as an enterprise goes, that's really valuable because that means that you can do rapid prototyping. You then push it into the end-to-end orchestrator, which is the top of this pyramid you can see here. I'll touch on in a second. The end-to-end orchestrator basically receives what's basically a business proposal from the board of directors or whoever. Some of the things that I dealt with in telecom is a CEO would read a news article, pass it to an EVP and say, make me this. So then you'd reverse whatever was in that news article, turn it into a business case, feed it to the end-to-end orchestrator. The end-to-end orchestrator says, this is what I've been told to do at a business level, at a metadata level. I need to do long distance for bank boards of directors in a special way. That proposal will then go to the various domain orchestrators, one of which is the security orchestrator, and they will say, yes, we do have the network resources to be able to do that. You want to have 2056-bit encryption. We do have modules for that somewhere in the network. Therefore, the network that delivers whatever it is you want has to take this specific path, this, for instance, red line, which is called a network slice, which I'll get into in a second. Those business requirements for the domain orchestrator then go to the virtual infrastructure, to the software-defined network. So we are already getting into the software-defined mobile network core. They then go from that into the self-organizing network core, which is self-management of the radio network necessary for doing things like cellular radio. And then eventually they go to the 5G new radio, so as to push lots and lots of data to things like IoT, fog computing, and the Internet of Everything, which includes people. So all of the issues and problems and hiccups that come along the way, which might include security issues, feed into real-time network intelligence, and then go back into the certification design studio so they can get improved the next time. Out of band, out of production, as quickly as possible. So this cycle here is also an incident response cycle. It's a business improvement cycle. It's a billing cycle. When laws change, they follow this cycle. And you can predict it. The other thing about it that lends itself to prototyping is that this cycle can be simulated. You don't have to hit commit. So if you think as a telco CTO, you want to, somebody says, my CEO wants me to do something. I think it'll cost $100 million, but I have no proof. However, I've been told to get it done in 6 months anyway. He thinks it'll generate $20 million. I think it'll cost $100 million. I don't think it's wise, but I can't compete with his authority. So you just run a simulation and say, yes, it would cost $100 million. Does that influence your decision? Should I change my priorities? Or you can run 50 things and find out which one is the best. And by the way, you don't have to buy any hardware. You don't have to talk to anybody. You can get one guy working in the backyard, working remotely. He gives you the simulation, and he can tell you all of the potential things that are out there that are cheapest and most effective to do. The inverse of that is what attacks are most expensive. So if you take that original threat model, it maps to everything in a orchestrated 5G environment like this. So all of the various frauds and so on at the payment and debt level are at the bottom here. The various devices are at the SON and 5G kind of level. The 6G cognitive radio and 5G, that's really where this modeling gets refined. And the telecom applications are the places, you know, your CTO shows up and says, I want to have roam anywhere. I want to have $0 billing for high-end celebrities. So we can do billing, free marketing. All of those kinds of things happen at this kind of level. And then finally, the customer application, the idea we want to have mobile data. We want to change our strategy. We want to have our own non-circuit switch kind of environment. All of those things happen here. So I mentioned slicing briefly. One of the things that reduces the cost in things like 5G is the idea that you can make an ad hoc custom network to respond to things like DDoS, or a requirement to do wiretap, or a requirement to do pretty much anything. So you just instantiate it up here as part of the business requirement. All of these business requirements come down until they actually hit the end device. So this particular thing, that red line here, this slice, looks like this at a threat model level. So when you, as a human, having dealt with lots of things like fraud examination or wiretap or terrorist money laundering or any of these kinds of things that hit the telco domain, being infrastructure, if you can map them out manually by just basically drawing your line through this collection of models, which has more depth underneath it certainly, now you have all of that training information that you then feed into machine learning and deeper, more automated processes. So we'll get into the actual machine learning part of the presentation pretty quick. We've been in the orchestration part. So this is the ETSI NFV, Network Function Virtualization Standard. It, you know, if somebody's from ETSI's in the room, I apologize. ETSI doesn't have a lot of what I would characterize as security, the ability to catch people. There's a lot of hardening, sure, but it doesn't have, you know, central management. It doesn't do things like hardening security status. It doesn't have some of these more relevant details. And at this point, I'll mention one thing, slightly off topic. Something that I encounter a lot in the telecom security domain is the need for apex responders. So some of the folks in the room may be apex responders, but I'll describe it this way, is somebody that has intelligence relationships and law enforcement relationships and technical relationships and criminal underground relationships is pretty much the only guy that can deal with 5G issues. And the reason for that is that anytime you want to actually get into, find out what's going on in a telecom environment, one of the first things you have to do is look at very detailed relationships of very deep, unencrypted telecom data. Well, to do that, you need a law enforcement relationship so they can issue you a production order, bring you in as more or less a deputy, so you can then look at your own data. Because now, because you're deputized, you're no longer doing criminal wiretap, so as to be able to do incident response. If you have very strong apex responder relationships, they'll issue that to you in seconds. Or they'll just sit on the bridge with you and pretend to deputize you so you can have your work done much more effectively. And they like doing that because when they do that, they get to write up the investigative report and go and arrest somebody. And from their point of view, they're getting free consulting. From your point of view, you're doing your job. So some of the things that, so in the write-up for this presentation, I mentioned some of the things that are use cases that are that jump out at the last minute, especially when talking about things like 5G or software-defined mobile networking or these kinds of things. Sometimes when folks put in a 5G network, they forget, conveniently or accidentally, that they still have to do all of their national security wiretap requirements. And if they actually try to launch a 5G network without having the ability to do lawful access, wiretap, deliver on intelligence requirements, they may have their law enforcement or national security agency show up and say, turn it off. You just put $200 million in this thing, or $500 million. You can't use it because you're incapable of meeting your national security requirements. If you put this thing in and turn it on, speaking as a fictitious national security person, if you put this thing in and turn it on, and it has no national security requirements, it has no capability for doing wiretap, that means every criminal will just use this one platform. And as soon as they use that platform, that means that terrorism and everything else will just explode. So for that reason, they step in and say, no, you can't turn it on, which has impacted some carriers in the world and caused them to delay their launch by as much as a year. This is a very complex issue. It's how to continue with that visual metaphor from the beginning. How do you have a lightning bolt when some of it is a different color? How do you mandate that a lightning bolt does anything? As soon as you do that mandate, you're actually changing its nature, and it's not actually a lightning bolt anymore. It's just cabling, which is now expensive. Some of the other context about 5G, and this all ties in with machine learning as well, is that 5G, because it does have a relationship with space, perhaps you've had no reason to spend any time thinking about it, the legal jurisdiction of Earth is only about 100 miles from the surface of the Earth. Anything that's more than that is almost entirely unregulated, and almost anything that happens beyond that jurisdiction, beyond that range, is effectively non-criminal, non-illegal, non-regulated. There's a few treaties like the Tallinn Manual and the Outer Space Treaty and a few other ones, but when you have things like satellites that have the capability of doing things like pivoting data, have the ability of performing processes on board, bank-like processes, what you have is, in effect, an orbital network, which in Starlink, the SpaceX Elon Musk orbital internet, of which 2 have been launched already. So this 12,000 satellite network, which is planned, and there's versions of it that are planned by other companies, when it launches, the entirety of that thing will have the ability of moving data from outside the jurisdiction of Earth to other places outside the jurisdiction of Earth, do processing outside the jurisdiction of Earth, and be completely outside Earth's banking, financial, government, everything, infrastructure. So from a data sovereignty point of view, there is none. It's space. But there's an entity called the Asgardia Space Nation. The Space Nation of Asgardia is setting up, with UN support, and a billionaire to finance it, a Russian billionaire by the name of Igor Asher-Bailey. This entity, the Space Nation of Asgardia, is about to become humanity's first space nation, an entirely orbital, non-Earth-bound, embassies will be on Earth, obviously, an orbital, non-Earth-bound country. So it will be the only place where data sovereignty exists in orbit. And predictably, it's launched its first 2 kinds of currency, which are both blockchain. So you can see where things are going already. So this is a use case that we'll get into right about now. So using supervised learning to predict cyber attacks. So certainly, and there was a presentation on this earlier today, certainly when you have a variety of different things that you're interested in, which might be typical threat actors who have impacts of, $2 million a hit, it can be argued one of the biggest threat actors is actually the GDPR regulators. So if, for instance, you're a international bank and you operate in 55 countries, like one of the ones that I worked for, well, if you have a centralized database and it's harvesting information from all its jurisdictions, 55 countries, 55 times GDPR fines is what we were looking at for our risk profile. And that's just one bank. So if you can imagine having a threat actor who is effectively self-financing and can hire more staff with the revenue that they've earned, that's a really big deal. From a banking point of view, that's profound. That was actually a bigger risk from a forward-looking threat point of view than any hacker, organized crime group, money laundering ring of any kind. So this is why it was lumped in with cyber attacks, is because basically the idea is that you get pinged by some sort of bad guy and then immediately get GDPR'd. So this is actually the machine learning part. So we talked about 5G briefly, and the idea that when you do threat modeling in a telecom domain, you have to take into account the fact that it's a life-critical banking, financial transaction with inherent money laundering, which allows you to skip around from supply chain to supply chain to supply chain, from carrier to carrier to carrier, and do wire transfer from within one carrier to another carrier while ignoring things like money laundering regulations. So in a cognitive network, basically you have your managed orchestration, your MANO, and this is basically all of your domain orchestrators, including things like a security orchestrator. It is providing rules to the managed elements, the virtual network functions, and network function virtualization infrastructure. It's providing SDN controller information to the tenant controllers. The data collection, the vast amounts of data that come into a telco is over here, where you'd actually gather up all that information from the threat models that I showed you earlier, which might come from law enforcement, and might come from other carriers, and might come from providers of threat intel. Might come from GSMA if you're lucky. And then finally, you get your model selection and data pre-processing. These ones are relatively critical because here, from one of the groups that I'm a part of is the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. It has more than 400 types of fraud, many of which have existed in human history for 4,000 years. So these models are actually so popular that they never go out of style. So you can actually just enter that in your model selection and data processing, and your network inevitably will catch them, because people just never stop using their favorite kinds of fraud. And because there's so many of them, and they're not really, as far as I know, they're not reflected at all in the IT domain. And they're very, very present in the telecom domain because of the intrinsic nature of these financial transactions and the unregulated nature of it. Including those models in something like data processing and model selection is really critical. So the other part of it too is unsupervised learning. So in the second slide, I showed a screenshot, which was part of pattern recognition, but certainly you can include things like negative reinforcement. So basically, it's the idea that you downgrade entire models when they're identified as being not unsuccessful, or being a whitelisted business activity, or something that you don't have the manpower to follow up on at the moment, something that's maybe too small in terms of financial impact to bother with. So the other things that are really interesting there is that you can use chosen input data. In a telco, they'll have fraud departments, so you can certainly include things like, this is the uptake of a certain class of initial registration fraud, subscription fraud, international revenue sharing fraud. These are how many phones are bought around the beginning of the school year, but their SIM cards are not activated until after a month. Well, criminals buy phones at the beginning of the school year so as to hide from fraud systems. But if the SIM card is put into the phone and activated within a day or two, you can tell it's probably an actual student who received that phone and started using it. If the SIM card was obtained using the typical fraud algorithms, and the SIM card is sent off to the left to another country for the sake of international revenue sharing fraud, and the phone is then sold to yet another country for the sake of being resold again. The fact that there was a month in which that SIM card was not registered or put in the phone, that's really obvious fraud. So when you actually get a little bit deeper into that, you can start to say things like, past 6 days in this physical neighborhood, this physical part of a physical city in which folks make a lot of money. As soon as in neighborhoods where people make a lot of money, the fraud is really, really obvious. When the neighborhoods make a lot less money, the fraud is much less obvious. However, you can start doing clustering and association so as to be able to determine that, in fact, these calling patterns, A to B calling patterns, always include somebody that's part of an organized crime ring or has used a stolen phone in the last month or is using a stolen SIM card or whoever. So as soon as you do that kind of thing, without having to do anything resembling wiretap within your telco or at a SIP trunking level or anything like that, you can start to actually say at a telecom level, at a phone number level, that this is in fact something that is an organized crime ring and that they're in fact doing things like selling child porn, updating eBay sites in which they are, well, one of the things that we also track is things like organized crime when they do things like they'll put something of very low but potential sentimental value on something like an eBay site, so maybe something like a low-value baseball card. There'll be a picture embedded in the website, and that picture will also have a link leading to something like child porn or guns or drugs or whatever it might be. And by paying an inflated value for that sentimental item of whatever it might be, then you unlock that thing. So these are some of the things that we track when we do clustering. Often the clustering leads to things like phone numbers. And this is basically a representation of that. So we have lots of data leading into unsupervised learning that then gives us the clusters as mentioned, which shows us things like these people are part of organized crime. And we also get lower dimensional data, which turns into saying that these are things like bank accounts, and the bank accounts are used for things like money laundering, so then we get money laundering detection. And then we can turn it into supervised learning, which is really the data modeling that we would use for something like an actual financial crime investigation. And then the model is something that we can use next time for doing a similar investigation. And certainly when we do that, we wind up with classification, regression, and clustering. And we wind up, all of this then becomes very repeatable for the next investigation. Tying this back into 5G, when you actually look a little bit deeper into it, what you can do is do things like modeling to say that this particular cell tower is doing a particular thing at a particular time. You can start doing log analysis at a lower level. And when a really critical thing that I mentioned a little earlier is femtocells and cell towers are often the place where this kind of thing originates. So when you're actually breaking the telecom business model, actually finding those little cell towers, which are completely legitimate, they might have been obtained from an actual carrier as part of a subscription, you have to dig those out. And digging them out is really difficult. So actually finding that at a machine learning and clustering level is of high value. And here's some of the means that you can do that. I'll kind of skip ahead. I've been going a little bit slow. So here's a few points that I'd bring up sort of in closing. In 5G and software-defined networking and national security, especially when you tie it back into things like wiretap and influencing things like the procurement of companies, influencing things like mergers and acquisitions, you wind up in a really interesting new trend called grid convergence. So in places where they have a lot of support, a lot of forward-looking research. There's the idea that 5G, backed by transaction integrity from things like blockchain, can be used to swap a lot of the functions of telecom and banking. So your telecom system is your banking system is your telecom system. And when you do that, it makes it very, very effective to manage your actual energy sector that way because you have enhanced security. Well, when you do that and it's all on blockchain, making those blockchain transactions, those blockchain tokens available to everybody so they can then invest in your infrastructure, in your economy, becomes really profitable. So now that we have in the world the House of Saud diversifying from oil, they have their Minister of Artificial Intelligence for IoT, 5G, and robotics, $200 billion in investment and the backing from Crown Prince. This is what they're talking about doing with 5G. So they're talking about basically rebuilding their entire country, making it a 5G country, which is also a 5G bank, which is also a 5G energy sector, so they can get away from oil and it'll be on blockchain so people can invest in it intrinsically without having to rely on foreign dollars or gold standards or foreign dollars, like being backed by, for instance, the US.
We have still 5 minutes for question. So please feel free.
Does anyone have any questions at this time?
Don't be shy. He will not eat you. No, so I guess we can go for the final words, if it's fine with you. Okay, thanks.
So I'll kind of skip ahead. So there's a few more points here. This particular slide, you probably can't read from where you're sitting, but I mentioned earlier there's a lot of changes in 5G and how the models work. So the old models for identity are very concrete. We know you, this is who you are, because the new models through the middle of the slide are all risk-based. Basically, everything is handled at a much higher level, a much more risk-based, much more bucketized kind of situation. So I mentioned in the previous slide that 5G SIM card aggregation was an issue because you would basically have a procurement person managing 100,000 SIMs, and basically that is your first and only line of defense for most incidents, especially at a financial or fraud level. In these new models, they're all like that. So identity is much more bucketized. Telcos are much less interested in things like who is on the end of the phone than the fact that the phone is billable. If you're a company and you buy 100,000 phones, does the telco actually care who you gave those phones to? Not especially. It's a lot of overhead and a lot of management for them. So if they just ship you a pallet of phones as a large employer, and you then take those phones out and provide them to your employees, in effect, the phone, a smartphone, is now part of IoT. The other thing about it is that because 5G is so granular and has such continuous surveillance, it knows where the phone is, it knows where you are, it knows everything about you. Does it really matter if you use a password? It knows who you are, it knows you're billable, it knows who you work for, it knows that it's a corporate phone. Do you need to log into it? It knows where you sleep, it knows what's going on. Some of the other things there is that because it does have such pervasive surveillance at the millimeter wave level, because it is so granular and so consistent and knows who you are over time, it's in effect a reputation system. It knows that you live in a particular place, it knows who lives at that particular place, and it knows who you are with more detail than, for instance, your wallet would be capable of telling somebody. As far as strategy goes, the machine learning models I mentioned earlier are in a lot of ways more effective than typical humans in creating and proposing strategy. So if it can crawl the network and say, your security strategy would cost you $100 million a year to actually execute, I've got another one using cheapest path routing that only costs $20 million a year to execute, would you like me to use this one? Well, chances are pretty good if you've used orchestration rules that have been vetted and audited, that it's actually a much better strategy than something that a human would come up with. And it'll come up with these each time you run it. Certainly when you talk about things like predictive modeling, when you run simulations and it comes back and says, this is something cheaper, that's a simulation. If you let it run simulations every time you have network capacity, you'll wind up with far more detailed, far more inexpensive, far more business justified things that you can actually do with the network than the relatively legacy model that is used in telco today. As far as online payments go, because SIM cards are payment cards, one of the things that most banks are doing in the world today is something called omni-channel, the idea that all customer experiences lead to one path and lead to then one family, one opportunity for billing the customer. Because SIM cards are payment cards, why would you have a credit card? 5G can see a SIM card, and it already knows who you are. It already has all the financial reputation, all the details that it would need to pass to a bank so as to know who you are and know whether or not you're capable of paying that bill. Well, if the SIM card's capable of doing that, why would you just not route your purchase, whatever it might be it boots or a jacket or a car rental, to the SIM card payment, and you would then pay the telco rather than a credit card company. Because SIMs are less regulated, they're also less expensive, and the cost of those financial transactions is far less. It also already works everywhere in the world, which is something that, as far as omni-channel goes, is something that banks will struggle with for the next few years.
Okay, I guess you should jump to the final conclusion. Time's up.
Its final conclusion, 5G is not only much more fast, it's much more comprehensive. As far as incident response goes, there's a lot of opportunity there. When we talk about apex responders, 5G, because of its capacity and its throughput and its complexity, apex responders are really the only ones that can respond in a 5G environment. But if it's got 1,000 times throughput, your staff will just walk up and leave. And the idea that because it is so heavily automated, it's so much less expensive than a normal network. If it's well designed through the use of orchestration, what you'll wind up with is something that has less risk, is more profitable, and more secure.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.